Thomas Hale had once been known as the heart of the little town, the man whose clocks never chimed a minute late, whose gentle hands could coax life back into the oldest, rustiest gears. His shop had been a warm place, golden lamplight, the soft tick of clocks layered like comforting music, and the quiet laughter he once shared with his wife, Eleanor, as they worked side by side. But those days had frozen, as surely as the frost that clung to his windows now. Since Eleanor's passing, time no longer felt like something meant to move. It felt like something meant to be endured. Each morning, Thomas followed the same silent ritual. Wake before dawn, sit in the old wooden chair by the window, and stare at the clocks that continued ticking despite everything. Their unbroken rhythm felt almost cruel, a reminder that the world was moving forward even though he could not. The shop remained closed, the sign outside hanging crooked in the winter wind. Dust settled on the counter where Eleanor once folded cloth, and the projects she left unfinished sat untouched on the shelves, too painful for Thomas to even glance at. He rarely spoke, rarely ate, and never dared to wind the clocks fully. Their louder chimes reminded him too much of her voice in the shop, humming along as she worked. On this morning, one that looked no different from the 100 before it, he sat as usual, wrapped in the heavy stillness of the room. Outside, the world was pale blue and brittle with cold. A sigh escaped him, one that rose from a place far deeper than tired lungs. Then, tap. A small sound, so faint he first imagined it. Tap. Tap. Thomas blinked and looked toward the frosted pane. There, standing on the narrow ledge, was a cardinal, feathers burning bright against the winter gray, head tilted as if studying him. It tapped once more, gentle and persistent, as if asking him to notice something he had forgotten long ago.
The next morning, Thomas rose with no expectation of change. Habit carried him from bed to chair, his movements slow and heavy, as though the air itself resisted him. But as he pulled the curtain aside, the world outside shifted in a small, almost imperceptible way. The cardinal was there again. Perched on the same narrow ledge, its feathers glowed softly in the pale morning light, a quiet flame against the cold. It wasn't tapping this time. It simply looked at him, head slightly tilted, as if waiting for him to acknowledge it. Thomas hesitated, unsure why the sight stirred something warm beneath his ribs. He reached forward, and for the first time in weeks, pulled the window open just a crack. A thin ribbon of cold air slipped into the room, carrying with it a faint scent of pine and distant chimney smoke. The cardinal didn't fly away. Instead, it ruffled its feathers lightly, letting out a soft chirp. Not a song, just a note, delicate and patient. Thomas found himself whispering, "You're a persistent little thing," though his voice felt foreign from lack of use. As the days passed, the cardinal's visits grew into a simple, gentle rhythm. Each dawn it returned, tapping sometimes, waiting other times, and Thomas began rising with a sense of expectation he didn't dare name. He started opening the curtain earlier. One morning, he even pushed the window wider, letting sunlight spill across his workbench, illuminating dust that floated like tiny stars in the air. He found himself reaching for a cloth to wipe the bench, then a brush to sweep the floor. His hands, which had forgotten purpose, began remembering the shapes of tools, the feel of brass gears, the sound of winding springs. He didn't rush. He didn't even try. He simply followed the small, almost invisible sparks of life returning to him, one breath at a time. And every morning, the cardinal watched. Quiet, steady, as though guiding him back toward a world he had not realized he'd been slowly re-entering.
It happened on a morning that began just like the others, a gray, brittle winter dawn where the cold seemed to seep through the walls. Thomas had opened the window early, letting the light spill gently across the shop while he waited for the soft flutter of red wings he had come to expect. The cardinal arrived, landed on the ledge with its familiar tilt of the head, and offered a quiet chirp that almost felt like a greeting. For the first time in months, Thomas answered the bird with a faint smile. It was small, but real. Feeling a strange but welcome comfort, he returned to the workbench, intending to sort a box of old brass gears. As he reached for the tools, his hand brushed against something buried beneath a sheet of cloth, something wooden, cold, and familiar. He froze. Slowly, he lifted the cloth. There it was, the last clock he and Eleanor had begun together, a handcrafted wooden piece with delicate carved vines along the frame and a brass pendulum shaped like a teardrop. They had talked about finishing it as a gift for their anniversary. The date had come and gone long ago, but the project remained, silent, unfinished, like a wound that refused to close. Pain struck him with the force of a memory he had tried desperately to bury. He saw her smile, the way she brushed sawdust from her hands, the warmth in her voice when she said, "This one will mark a new beginning for us." Thomas stumbled back from the bench as if the memory itself had weight. His chest tightened, breaths short and sharp. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward. He slammed the window shut. The cardinal startled and flew away, disappearing into the blur of winter branches. The sudden absence was immediate, jarring, a silence that rang louder than any clock. Hands trembling, he covered the unfinished clock again. The ache that had briefly eased flooded back, heavier than before. He extinguished the small lamp he had begun using again and retreated to his chair, pulling the curtains closed until the room dimmed into a muted gray. The cold returned, inside him more than out. The days that followed felt heavier than the winter snow piling against Thomas's door. Whatever progress he had begun to make slipped away the moment he uncovered that unfinished clock. Now the workshop seemed haunted by memories he wasn't ready to face. He kept the curtains drawn, shutting out the light entirely. Without the gentle glow of morning, the shop returned to the muted, colorless state it had lived in since Eleanor passed. Dust resumed its quiet claiming of every surface. The air felt stale again, thick with neglect. Thomas avoided the workbench at all costs. Even walking past it made his breath hitch. He convinced himself that reopening the wound had been a mistake, that the small glimpses of healing the cardinal had offered were illusions he shouldn't have trusted. In his mind, moving forward meant leaving Eleanor behind, and he clung to the pain because it was the last place she still existed with him. He shut down every spark that tried to rise inside him. The clocks remained unwound, ticking unevenly or not at all. The tools stayed untouched. He returned to sitting in his wooden chair, staring into nothing, his hands clasped tightly as if holding himself together. And outside, the winter grew harsher. One morning, a soft tapping came from the other side of the curtain, faint but unmistakable. The cardinal had returned. Thomas held his breath, waiting for the sound to stop. The tapping continued, gentle but persistent, as if calling out to him. He pressed his palms to his ears. "Go away," he whispered, though the words broke halfway. But the tapping only grew softer, more spaced out, until finally it stopped. When the silence settled, it felt final, like something precious had slipped through his fingers. Snow drifted heavily across the window that day, layering over the glass until the outside world disappeared completely. Thomas stayed inside that cocoon of denial, holding grief close because he feared what would happen if he ever loosened his grip. What he didn't realize was that the very thing he was trying to protect was the thing keeping him frozen.
The days that followed felt heavier than the winter snow piling against Thomas's door. Whatever progress he had begun to make slipped away the moment he uncovered that unfinished clock. Now the workshop seemed haunted by memories he wasn't ready to face. He kept the curtains drawn, shutting out the light entirely. Without the gentle glow of morning, the shop returned to the muted, colorless state it had lived in since Eleanor passed. Dust resumed its quiet claiming of every surface. The air felt stale again, thick with neglect. Thomas avoided the workbench at all costs. Even walking past it made his breath hitch. He convinced himself that reopening the wound had been a mistake, that the small glimpses of healing the cardinal had offered were illusions he shouldn't have trusted. In his mind, moving forward meant leaving Eleanor behind, and he clung to the pain because it was the last place she still existed with him. He shut down every spark that tried to rise inside him. The clocks remained unwound, ticking unevenly or not at all. The tool stayed untouched. He returned to sitting in his wooden chair, staring into nothing, his hands clasped tightly, as if holding himself together. And outside, the winter grew harsher. One morning, a soft tapping came from the other side of the curtain, faint but unmistakable. The cardinal had returned. Thomas held his breath, waiting for the sound to stop. The tapping continued, gentle but persistent, as if calling out to him. He pressed his palms to his ears. "Go away," he whispered, though the words broke halfway. "Just go." But the tapping only grew softer, more spaced out, until finally it stopped. When the silence settled, it felt final, like something precious had slipped through his fingers. Snow drifted heavily across the window that day, layering over the glass until the outside world disappeared completely. Thomas stayed inside that cocoon of denial, holding grief close because he feared what would happen if he ever loosened his grip. What he didn't realize was that the very thing he was trying to protect was the thing keeping him frozen. The storm finally broke 3 days later, leaving the world washed in white and strangely still. Thomas hadn't opened the curtains once during that time. But on the fourth morning, a soft knock sounded at the shop door. Unexpected, hesitant, yet firm enough to draw him out of his chair. He considered ignoring it. Most people had stopped visiting long ago. But the knock came again, accompanied by the faint crunch of boots shifting on snow. With a sigh that felt older than he was, Thomas shuffled to the door and cracked it open. An elderly woman stood there, wrapped in a thick wool coat and holding a small tin feeder in her gloved hands. Her eyes, bright and gentle, despite her age, lifted to meet his. "Are you the one the cardinal keeps visiting?" she asked, her voice soft enough to blend with the winter air. Thomas blinked, uncertain. "I suppose so." She smiled, not with amusement, but with a kind of knowing empathy. "He's been perched on your ledge every morning, even through the storm. Cardinals don't usually linger that long in one place unless they feel safe there." He glanced away, unsure what to say, but she continued. "You know," she added, brushing snow from the tin feeder, "people think cardinals visit where they're needed, but that's not quite right. They return where they feel seen. There's a difference." Thomas swallowed, the words landing deeper than he expected. The woman tilted her head toward the window. "Whatever he's tapping for, it isn't to fix you. Birds don't heal broken clocks or broken hearts. They just remind us that life still sings, even when we can't hear it." Her smile warmed the cold between them. "And when you're ready, you'll listen." She placed the small feeder in his hands, nodded once, and walked away, her steps slow and steady across the snow-covered path. Thomas stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her disappear into the white morning. For the first time in days, he felt something shift, a quiet truth settling gently inside him. The feeder sat on the counter for an entire day before Thomas could bring himself to touch it again. He circled around it like a man approaching something fragile, afraid that even looking at it too long might stir pain he wasn't ready to face. But by the next morning, when the world lay quiet under a blanket of fresh snow, he found his hand resting on it without thinking. It felt surprisingly light. He stepped outside for the first time in weeks, boots sinking softly into the powder. The cold air stung his lungs, sharp but cleansing, the kind of cold that made him feel briefly, startlingly alive. He hung the feeder near the window, brushing snow off the branch as his breath curled in thin clouds around him. When he returned inside, he left the curtains open. Sunlight poured into the room, landing on the dusty shelves, catching the edges of brass gears long neglected. The familiar glow of morning warmed the wooden counters, and for the first time Thomas didn't shrink from it. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves. He began small. A cloth passed over the counter, a broom whispering across the floor, the rhythmic click of a single clock as he gently wound it. He took his time, letting each motion steady him, grounding him, reminding him of who he had once been and who he might still be. Eventually, his gaze fell on the half-finished clock beneath the cloth. His chest tightened, but he forced himself to lift the sheet anyway. The carving was just as he remembered, elegant vines curling around the frame, Eleanor's design sketched faintly in pencil where she had planned to finish the engraving. His throat ached, but he didn't turn away. He placed the clock on the workbench, and then, as if sensing the moment, a soft flutter stirred outside. The cardinal landed on the feeder, feathers bright against the snow. It didn't tap this time. It simply watched, quiet and steady, as Thomas picked up the first tool. His hands trembled, but they moved. And that was enough.
Thomas woke before sunrise, not out of habit or heaviness, but with an unexpected sense of purpose. The workshop, once dim and stagnant, now felt like a place slowly waking alongside him. The wooden floor, the scent of oil and timber, the quiet hush of clocks waiting to be wound. All of it felt familiar again, not painful, not haunted, just his. He lit a small lantern on the workbench and ran his fingertips along the smooth, newly sanded curve of the unfinished clock. Days of steady work had brought it close to completion, the missing carvings traced, the gears aligned, the frame polished to a warm honey glow. The pendulum, shaped like a teardrop, no longer felt like a symbol of loss, but of love woven into craft. As the sky outside shifted from blue-gray to soft gold, Thomas gave the final screw a gentle turn. The mechanism clicked into place with a delicate, satisfying precision. He stepped back,
breath held without meaning to. The clock began to tick. Softly at first, then steady, rhythmic, alive. Emotion swelled in his chest, not the sharp sting of grief, but something warmer, like gratitude or quiet peace. He carried the finished piece to the window and set it carefully on the ledge, where the first rays of morning touched the wood. A moment later, a familiar flutter of red appeared. The cardinal landed beside the clock, feathers glowing like a small ember in the rising light. It tilted its head, studying the new creation, then burst into a gentle, flowing song, the first full melody Thomas had heard from it since the beginning of winter. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. Not as a sign, not as a message, just a presence, life returning in its own time. When he opened the shop door that day, flipping the sign from closed to open, he didn't feel like he was leaving anything behind. He felt like he was stepping into a morning he hadn't allowed himself to see.
The workshop settled into a soft stillness after the cardinal's song faded into the morning air. Thomas stood at the window for a long while, watching the small red bird linger near the finished clock. Its feathers glowed in the sunrise, a steady ember of warmth in the winter light. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Some truths arrive without words, through quiet moments, small signs, and the courage it takes to meet them halfway. As the town slowly woke and footsteps crunched along the snowy roads outside, Thomas rested a hand on the clock. He realized something simple yet profound. Healing had never been about forgetting Eleanor or letting the past dissolve like frost under the sun. It had always been about learning to live beside the memories, letting them become part of his days instead of shadows behind him. He turned from the window and breathed in the familiar scent of wood and oil. The shop felt alive again, not because everything was fixed, but because he was finally willing to grow, to change, to open the door. And so the story leaves you with a few gentle reminders, whispered like the soft tap of wings on a winter window. 1. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small signs. 2. Grief isn't something to outrun. It's something to walk beside. 3. Even in the coldest seasons, life finds a way to sing again. 4. You don't have to move fast, only forward. 5. Love isn't lost when someone is gone. It lives in the things you continue. 6. Hope often begins the moment you open the curtain and let the light in. And 7. And sometimes the smallest visitor can guide you back to yourself. If this story touched you, stay a little longer. Listen for the small signs. And when you're ready, step into your own new dawn.